Dear Humphrey School friends and students, faculty and staff, honorary council members, advisory council members, alums, and partners, greetings. To my knowledge, this is the first time that the annual State of the School address, required by our Constitution to be delivered by the Dean, is being pre-recorded and coming to you remotely. You don't need me to tell you that a remote State of the School address is just a tiny part of a whole sea of adaptive practices and challenges and adjusted activities that we have all experienced as a school community this past year, and we continue to experience them today. What I'd like to do in my comments today, just briefly, is to situate the work of the Humphrey School this past year in the broader societal context of what has been happening. And then I will zoom in and share some specific data points that will give you a sense of where we are as a school in terms of our budget, student enrollment, and engagement metrics of our alumni and community partners. And then finally, before I wrap up, I'd like to share with you a strategy and a vision for how I think we need to approach this next year as we move past a pandemic and towards a journey to the future of the school. So first, a little context. It seems apt when I hear reference to the multiple and intersecting pandemics we're experiencing. Each one taken alone would be devastating. A global pandemic, a resulting economic recession, and sky-high unemployment, in a year that also saw unprecedented and devastating weather events as a result of our climate crisis, and the persistent plague of racial inequities that disproportionately conspire to harm and disadvantage some people much more than others. Indeed, each one of these intersecting pandemics disproportionately impacts some people more than others. It would be utterly impossible to recap all the ways that our Humphrey community has stepped up to face the cascade of onslaughts this past year. Still, I can't share them all, but I would like to share a few by way of illustration. Let's start with last March. With barely a week's notice, we closed this school building and moved to a virtual academic learning environment. Our remarkable director of technology, Kate Connors, had long been planning her retirement for that month. And when we went into remote operations, she immediately stepped up to postpone her retirement to help us make this critical pivot. Our curriculum support and design team totally shifted their workload to learn how to build excellent online learning environments for our students. And our faculty spent countless non-teaching hours completing online tutorials and learning at a feverish pace how to deliver effective and engaging graduate level instruction online, even those who had never taught online and even those who never wanted to teach online before. We have students and alumni who pulled together, organized, and dedicated their own resources to support classmates who were disproportionately financially hard hit by the pandemic, and that work continues today. To address the school's immediate pandemic-related financial challenges, dozens of faculty and staff in those early weeks of the pandemic voluntarily stepped up to participate in a salary reduction program. Our faculty unanimously supported the decision to totally freeze and in some cases claw back all of the professional development and travel funds that they had allocated to them. And many contributed personal funds to the university's emergency support program for students. At the same time, many of our faculty and staff pivoted their research to dedicate their tremendous policy analysis and inquiry skills to the cause of understanding the trajectory of the pandemic and its impact on people. Our faculty offered public guidance on timely research topics ranging from the impact of licensing requirements on how healthcare workers can respond flexibly to the pandemic. Think about all those retired doctors who were constrained from participating in support because of their licensing requirements. We offered policy guidance on that. We offered guidance on how telecommuting is best supported through urban and rural infrastructure planning and policy, a very timely topic at the beginning of the pandemic. And we've shared a lot of information and shown a bright light on how we might develop policies that respond to the tragic reality that frontline workers most vulnerable to COVID-19 exposure are also most vulnerable to layoffs and long-term unemployment. Tragically, we know that this is disproportionately people of color and young women who also have young children at home at that time because they weren't in school or they weren't in childcare. Of course, I am biased, but I gotta say this past year, our faculty have elevated the notion of being a publicly engaged scholar to an absolute art form, and I couldn't be more proud of that. In May, we witnessed the horrifying killing of George Floyd not far from the Humphrey School, and this community and the country experienced the groundswell of righteous outrage that followed. Again, members of the Humphrey School individually and collectively responded in multiple ways, by peacefully protesting injustice, by helping to mitigate the impact of uprisings on immigrant and minority-owned businesses across the city, by coordinating food distribution and housing support for people who lost their jobs or their homes as a result of the uprising, by working with the city to examine and reimagine policing policy and public safety. Concurrently, and with an eye toward longer-term and systemic responses, we have hosted multiple forums on race, public safety, and policing in America. Our own professor, Dr. Samuel Myers, just received a prestigious Russell Sage Fellowship so that he is able to complete his book on his really brilliant and insightful analysis of what he has come to call the Minnesota paradox, exploring why exactly it is that this seemingly progressive state continues to experience some of the worst racial disparities in the country across multiple dimensions: education, employment, housing. Along with University of Minnesota Law School Dean Gary Jenkins and School of Public Health Dean John Finnegan, the three of us reached out to what is called the Posse Caucus in the Minnesota Legislature, POCI, the People of Color and Indigenous Caucus, and together with them, we formed an MOU so that we can have a long-term internship agreement with them so that public health, public policy, and law students can work together to support their racial justice policy work over time. And I am very proud that Humphrey School professor Kathy Quick, whose own scholarship includes a focus on public administration and public safety, was just recently, just in the last week, tapped by University President Joan Gable to co-chair the university's new MSAFE implementation team that will help the university implement policy around policing and public safety as a result of a year-long analysis that's been done. I also want to recognize members of this community, particularly our students and alums, who continue to push and advocate for the Humphrey School itself to look inward and more fully live into our espoused values of equity, inclusion, and justice. Some of this advocacy has taken the form of very public petitions from students, and some of it has taken the form of more private recommendations and conversations directed to leadership, faculty, and staff of the school. By design, student activism and demands for change creates tension in the status quo. Throughout history, this has been an essential ingredient of change, progress, and innovation in higher education. So although I can't say honestly that I enjoy the discomfort, I do believe we are better as a school because of the push we've received from our students this past year. So what are we doing in response to that push? We are doubling down on our school-wide equity and inclusion goals. We're taking a careful look at our curriculum through a lens of our values. We're adding courses where we think we need to, and we're shifting learning objectives where that seems warranted. This fall, we worked with an external consultant to hold confidential listening sessions with our Humphrey students of color to seek their insights and feedback with a guarantee of anonymity of their participation. Out of those listening sessions came 22 concrete recommendations that those students believe would make the Humphrey School a more welcoming place for all students of color. We take those recommendations very seriously and are now reviewing and acting upon them, and will soon be issuing a status report on our progress. I'm grateful to those students for making the time to share those recommendations. We're working hard to increase the racial and ethnic diversity of our students, our faculty, and staff. And I wanted to stop here or pause here and take just a moment to talk about why this is so important. Ensuring a racially diverse community carries its own ethical and moral imperatives. But I hasten to add that it does not itself equate to equity or to full inclusion. That takes more work. Still, the evidence is very clear that real learning communities, those that prioritize inductive thinking, innovation, the creation of new knowledge, the synthesis of ideas, this kind of learning community is more robust and more successful when it is diverse. A few years ago, there was a really interesting research article published in Scientific American titled "How Diversity Makes Us Smarter." And I find the summary, the synthesis of the key idea of that paper to be particularly compelling. They write, and I quote, "It seems obvious that a group of people with diverse individual expertise would be better than a homogeneous group at solving complex, non-routine problems. It is less obvious that social diversity should work in the same way, yet science shows that it does. This is not only because people with different backgrounds bring new information. Simply interacting with individuals who are different than we are," and here I digress and say different than we are, as the article says, along the dimensions of race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, country of origin, primary language spoken. Individuals who are different forces group members to prepare better, to anticipate alternative viewpoints, and to expect that reaching consensus will take effort. This is the kind of learning community we want for the Humphrey School as we grapple with the complex challenges of climate policy, public sector leadership, election administration, voting rights, global human rights, all the things we focus on. We are better when we are diverse as a community. So, despite pandemic-related financial challenges, we are determined to maximize the things that we think lead to that level of diversity. We are maximizing our efforts to extend financial aid to highly qualified students so that cost is less of a barrier. We are determined to continue to support our Junior Summer Institute, the residency program for underrepresented undergraduate students who want to enter fields of public affairs. And this year, for the first time, the Humphrey School is participating in the President's Postdoctoral Fellowship Program in partnership with the University of California. And this is a program designed to encourage outstanding PhD students of color to enter the field of higher education, to enter the academy and seek faculty careers. This year, we extended 2 offers to 2 remarkable candidates through that program. And I would love to tell you more about them, but they've not yet accepted our offers, so I will wait for that announcement. But I can tell you we are very eager to welcome them both to campus next fall, should they accept our offer. All of this and so much more has happened since I stood before you last year and said that the state of the Humphrey School is strong. And despite all of the substantial challenges this past year, I stand before you again today and tell you that the state of the Humphrey School is indeed strong. We have most certainly been tested this past year, and we have learned hard lessons about living our values. I don't imagine, to be perfectly honest, that we will fully emerge from our financial challenges for quite some time yet. But we have a sturdy foundation and an enormously talented community of partners, scholars, students, alums that keep us at the leading edge of public affairs education. Indeed, we do remain a top 10 school. Our degree programs, public forums, and faculty research stand as national exemplars in our field. This year, we also have an interesting and distinct honor of being the public affairs school to watch when it comes to building leadership across our field. Let me give you a couple of examples. Long-term Humphrey faculty member Kay Husbands-Feeling, who was a member of our graduate faculty in our science, technology, and environmental policy area for quite some time, this year was just promoted to lead the largest college at Georgia Tech, the College of Liberal Arts there. She is now the dean. Our own Associate Dean, Carissa Slaughterbeck, left us last summer to assume the deanship at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh. We're honored, very honored, that Dr. Catherine Squires has joined us as our next Associate Dean, and I'll say a little bit more about Catherine in a moment. And then just this past month, Professor Jody Sanford, who has been at the Humphrey School a very long time, left us to assume the deanship at the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Washington. So the Humphrey School is having impact all over this country and influencing the way we approach public affairs education. We're making an impact in so many ways. And with that, I want to turn just briefly to some specific data points for your reference as we think about the year that was and the year ahead. In the past several years, at the same time that I deliver the State of the School address, we release a little document called Humphrey Counts that is at-a-glance data around core metrics for the school around our budget, enrollments, and engagement. So that's not being printed this year because there's no one here to pick it up, but it will be available online and released, and it will look like this on our website, and you'll be able to zoom into particular elements of it. And I'm not going to go through all of it today, but I want to point out a few things for your reference, and we'll start with finances. Our FY22 operating budget was about $28 million, which is a little bit under, about $2 million, $2.5 million under our FY19 operating budget. And when you look at our revenue sources, I can explain where that dip was. We were down a bit in our endowment earnings. More significantly, our $7.3 million revenue from grants was down fairly substantially from 2019, where it was $14.2 million. This does not give me cause for concern because our grant cycles, our grant applications, our grant renewals are cyclical. So we see years like this where sometimes we have far more grant revenue than others. What I can tell you is we see hopeful signs on the horizon with the number of grant applications and favorable reviews from places like the National Institute of Health and the National Science Foundation. So I expect that number will go up. I also want to point to the tuition and student fees revenue of $8.1 million. This was our budget. That's what we budgeted. I can tell you that number dipped because we know that we were not able to retain all of our students when we went to online learning for all kinds of circumstances. I expect that number will dip again in our current fiscal year ending summer of 2021. So those are our revenues. And our expenditures, you'll see that our research expenditures tend to drop commensurate with our revenue, which isn't surprising. What I do want to point out is that our curriculum instruction and student support expenditures do not drop commensurate with our revenue in that area. Many of these are fixed costs, the cost of our faculty. We continue to offer classes even if the enrollment in those classes drops, unless they drop substantially below a threshold. So this is where our financial rub primarily comes, and we can turn to looking at student enrollments, and you'll understand a little bit more about this impact. But then I also want to share with you some really promising signals for the future. When we look at our current students, we currently have right now in this academic year 369 students. These are students enrolled in our degree programs, in our master's degree programs. This does not include the substantial number of students from across the campus and across the community who take classes with us. Let me put this in perspective. 369 this year. Last year, we had 389. And the year before that, we had 391. So in a 2-year time span, we've dropped 6%, excuse me, in our student enrollments. When we look at some of the causes of that, I can tell you, and this is not a partisan comment, that a substantial part of this is a dip in our Masters of Public Policy degree program and students seeking careers careers, not political appointments in the federal government. And in recent years, employment in the federal government has plummeted as there have been job freezes and things like the PMF, the Presidential Management Fellowship, has been on hold. It's had a really substantial chilling effect on our enrollments. On the next page, though, this is not in Humphrey counts, but I wanted to share this with you because I think it is a hopeful sign for the future. This table shows us graduate applications. Now, mind you, this is not enrollments. These are not students in the door, but it's a point-in-time measure. In this case, it's a point-in-time measure from January 27th, so a couple of weeks ago by the time you'll be viewing this address. So it's not what we know will happen in the fall, but if we look at it as a trend line, you'll see some positive things. First of all, this gives you application numbers for the last 3 years. So students applying to enter in the 2019-20 academic year, 2021, the year we're in, and the applications we're accepting now for fall of 21 for the 21-22 academic year. Our overall master's applications are up substantially from 392 2 years ago to 410 last year to 551 right now. I'm delighted to see those numbers. You'll note, I won't obviously go through all of this, we are up in every single area across all of our master's degrees. In particular, I want to point out the MPP, third from the bottom, the Masters of Public Policy, the degree I just talked about with a substantial dip, particularly for students seeking to enter federal government careers. That's a good number. We have gone from 160 to 155 to 229. I'm really excited about that. So now here's our challenge, sustaining the engagement of those applicants so that they want to be at the Humphrey School and indeed are able to be here. And although there are all kinds of things that we need to do to maintain our momentum, I think it's particularly predicated and contingent on a few things. One is our capacity to offer financial aid to students who otherwise would not be able to be here. And we are working mightily hard to complete our $20 million fundraising campaign that will wrap up this summer. And the vast majority of that is intended for student financial aid. We're really doubling down on that effort. Two is our capacity to emerge from the pandemic, because we all know eventually this will end. Our capacity to emerge from that and live into a future that won't be the same as the past. And I'm really proud to announce that our Associate Dean, Catherine Squires, who I mentioned joined us last fall, she comes to us from communication studies, so she's a long-term professor at the University of Minnesota, brilliant scholar, and a terrific leader. I have asked her to lead our efforts, our planning efforts, to emerge from this pandemic and re-enter a learning environment that will have been forever changed. I believe that will take creativity, it will take innovation, it will take compassion, and it will take a huge amount of wrangling of ideas and people and strategies and policy change. Catherine is well positioned to do this very well, and I'm very pleased that she will take up on this responsibility. And the third thing that I think we have to do to keep momentum on these, from moving from applicants to enrolled students, is that we have to take very seriously the part of our mission that says we inspire, educate, and support innovative leaders to advance the common good in a diverse and changing world. There's so many ways that we focus on our curriculum, but there's other ways that we focus on inspiring people. We brought Ibram Kendi in for our Distinguished Carlson Lecture last fall. He joined us remotely, and we were able to welcome thousands of people into that forum. When we can create the kind of environment where people feel like they can be in this community because they learn something, they're inspired, and they're supported by us, that's how we stay engaged with the partners and the prospective students that we want to stay engaged with. As I think about that, I think about this spring, and I'm really pleased also to announce at this point our commencement speaker, who I think is one of those people who can inspire, educate, and support policy leaders in so many ways. I was absolutely delighted to extend an invitation and have it accepted. And we'll have Keisha Gaskins Nathan, who is at the Rockefeller Brothers, be our commencement speaker this spring. Keisha is the director of the Democratic Practice Programs for the United States at the Rockefeller Fund. She is deeply focused on all things democratic systems in this country, thinking about our democratic culture, thinking about voting rights, thinking about supporting full and fair democratic opportunities for all people. I have a bias, but I think this is one of the brightest persons I've heard talk about democratic systems in America today. If her name sounds familiar to you, you might know that Keisha also has Minnesota roots. Early in her career, Keisha was the executive director of the League of Women Voters in Minnesota, and at one point in her career, she was also the executive director of the Minnesota Women's Political Caucus. And a lot of years ago, I'll just say that, she was a fellow here at the Humphrey School. We're delighted to have her join us this spring. And then that has me thinking about how students go from being interested applicants to enrolled students to very quickly being alums of the school. And we work very hard to do those same things, inspire, educate, and support our innovative leaders who are alumni. And I wanted to share this data slide with you because I'm very proud of the fact that I think we do this well. We don't have, by some standards, by university standards, a huge number of alums. We're a small school, but we're rounding up on 6,000, we'll be there soon, alums, and to be able to stay engaged with so many of them is a point of pride for me and should be a point of pride for this school. You will see on this slide that across every measure, those alumni who are occasionally engaged with their alma mater, moderately engaged, and highly engaged, we lead the university in annual engagement and lifetime engagement. I think that's very important. I'm grateful to our alumni. I talk a bit about our ability to support them. Alums' ability to support us is remarkable through their mentorship of our students, through their financial support of financial aid for students going forward, and through their engagement with us in webinars and teaching. They are terrific partners, and I'm grateful for that. So now let me turn to the future and talk about where I think we're headed and how I think we should get there. And in doing this, I want to share with you a brief story, and you'll wonder what this has to do with the Humphrey School. So bear with me. I'll circle back to that. In the late 1960s, 1970s, so a while ago, a guy by the name of D. Hawk, H-O-C-K, was a banker in Washington State, perceived as a really successful banker in Washington State, and he was tapped by Bank of America to step into their credit banking business that was on the brink. It was about to go under. Some of us will remember the stories of the possibility that MasterCard, wasn't yet Visa, but MasterCard, this whole credit banking industry was going to collapse, and maybe we wouldn't have a credit banking industry in this country. And then stepped in D. Hawk. And what he did first is what I believe any good leader would do going into any organization in that kind of situation. He set about getting to know the people and the processes and the structures in place within the organization so that he could better understand the problems and diagnose what was happening within this structure that was falling apart. Ultimately, D. Hawk made an observation that seems really stunningly simple, but it was in fact profound in its impact on the organization, ultimately saved the organization, and it changed the trajectory of D. Hawk's life. He observed that he saw cases or places within the organization where there was real chaos. Things were disorganized. People felt overwhelmed by the enormity of the problems. They were reacting to crises in the moment without giving much thought to strategy. They were driven by passion and pain and action that emerged from emotion, not calculated information or data. I saw craziness over here, chaos. And he also saw places within the organization where there was a lot of order, clear structures, lines of reporting, very tidy work plans, agendas organized to the minute, very, very structured, very, very ordered. And his observation was that both, left unchecked, both this chaos and this tight structure and order were harming, perhaps killing, the organization. And what he ultimately proposed as a move towards the future, as a move towards healing, was something of a Venn diagram. Like I said, it's pretty simple in its model. He proposed that we bring a little order to the chaos and a little chaos to the order, a Venn diagram. When I think about this, I've been reading about Dee Hock for years. I think about something that a student said to me this year as we were in the midst of the pandemic, the racial uprisings and the tensions. And in frustration, the student said to me, you know, feels like the world has problems and the university has departments. And it made me think of Dee Hock understanding the need to bring a little chaos to the order and a little order to the chaos. So Dee Hock, in talking about this early on, said, I believe it is in the center of this Venn diagram, in the blending of the organization's chaos and order, that innovation resides, creativity and insight reside. It is also where our human story, our pain and our suffering reside. It's where compassion resides. People weren't used to hearing those kinds of words in the banking industry at that time. But Dee Hock persisted, and he came to call this Venn diagram space, this overlapping space, the chaotic space, chaos and order, the chaotic space. And he asserted that people in learning organizations, organizations that learn, walk a path through that chaotic space, intentionally walk a path through that chaotic space. The act of learning resides in walking along that chaotic space. As a leader, sometimes I know I am most comfortable in the face of chaos by imposing order. My most predictable response to chaos, or unbridled passion, or outrage, or massive changes in our environments, is to impose more order, more structure. It is not always comfortable to move smoothly into that chaotic space and let in a little of the chaos. And yet I think Dee Hock was right. This is where real learning happens. It is where I personally learn to listen with more openness, to reflect, and to challenge my long-held assumptions. It's where I want to be, and it's where I want the school to be. It's where I believe a school of public affairs should be. And when I think about what happens in our classrooms right now in this remote environment, I think about all of the faculty members and instructors who are navigating this chaotic space as they think about the curriculum of their classes happening in the midst of a pandemic, a racial reckoning, climate crisis, all of those things. We're creating a chaotic space in our classrooms. The physicist Heinz Pagels, who you might recognize as somebody who wrote quite a lot about chaos theory, which has a lot in common with this notion of Dee Hock's chaotic path. He wrote the book Perfect Symmetry, and there's a line from that book that has stuck with me for a very long time. He writes, "The capacity to tolerate complexity and welcome contradiction, not the need for simplicity and certainty, is the attribute of an explorer." In our Humphrey School pursuit of innovation and new knowledge to help people and our planet to thrive, to live our mission of advancing the common good in a diverse and changing world, my greatest hope for members of this school community as we approach this very consequential year ahead of us, let's approach it as intrepid, curious explorers on a path, with an openness to blending a bit of our traditional sense of order. In higher education, we have a lot of it, with a little bit of the messiness and chaos of the world as it is. Let's approach it as curious explorers on a chaotic path towards new possibilities, broadened partnerships, and tremendous new potential in a post-pandemic reality. We can do this. You can do this. Thanks very much.